Hey guys, welcome back to another painting video. Today I'll show you how I painted my Death Riders from the new Death Korps of Krieg releases to resemble the box art, but only in about 2 hours per model.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANSMINIATURE. Games Workshop has been on a roll lately, releasing a ton of really cool cavalry units one after the other, and I love them, they look fantastic, and these new Death Riders are actually some of the best of the bunch, but if you want to paint a whole unit of them, well, one is fun, but 5 or 10 of them can be a bit of a chore. So in this video I will show you how you can get an end result that from an arm's length away will look quite similar to the box art, but you can achieve it with only a couple of simple techniques, only using a brush and spending not more than 2 hours per model. And if you want to follow along even easier, there is a 49-page PDF guide about this project with a ton of pictures, explanations and all the paints listed on my Patreon. For only a couple of bucks you get access to all the guides there and also support what I do in the process, so if that sounds good, check it out. Alright, without any further ado, let's put some paint on these bad boys. First of all, I started by doing a heavy zenithal highlight with grey sear from Citadel. And before you start yelling at me that I said I wouldn't use an airbrush, you can do this simply by using a can of grey sear primer. First you prime the whole model black and then you spray over that from only above and from the sides at a 45-degree angle or so, and you will achieve basically the same effect. I simply don't have the spray can version of this color. The important thing here is that the grey sear will work as a bright undercoat for the rest of the colors, and it will also serve as the base coat for the skin of the horses, so we won't have to laboriously paint those in with a brush, saving us a lot of time and effort. And since I used an airbrush, I also sprayed a layer of satin varnish over everything to protect my layers, but you don't need to do this if you use the grey sear primer out of a can. Now we are ready to start putting our base coats in place with a brush, and as usual I started with the most dominant colors on the model. Since the horse skin is already taken care of with the grey sear, I went for the blue armor on the mounts and the coats of the riders first. I used Oxford Blue from AK Interactive for this step. This is not exactly the color we want in the end, but don't worry, we will modify that anyway with the next step. For now, this will do quite nicely to block in the blue colors, so I added 2 quite thick coats of this so I can achieve coverage fast. Despite all those memes about thin coats, when you want to base coat something, it's not a great idea to thin your paints too much. It's enough to use the paint from the wet palette and leave a little moisture in the brush whenever you load it. That should be enough to give you good coverage and to allow the paint to self-level on the surface. To give you an idea, it took me a little over 20 minutes to cover all the elements with this fully on the 5 models. On the box art, the pants are the same color as the coats, but I like the different colored pants on the foot soldiers, so I used anthracite grey on them instead of the Oxford Blue. For all the gas masks on the horses, I used dark sand, once again using 2 thick coats to cover everything. But a bit later I realized that I needed to paint the masks on the riders as well, and while I was at it, I also used the same color on the wraps around their forearms as well. All the harnesses, the saddles and the straps are another very important element on these guys, since leather is arguably the second largest color surface on them. I used whole red as the base coat for all of those. This color covers super nicely, so in most cases I got away with a single thick coat. Just keep in mind that these elements can be a little bit tricky to paint if you want to go fast, since they are right next to the horse's skin, which ideally we don't want to mess up too much. Also, there are a ton of little straps holding the armor pieces on the riders, and they are inside other colors as well. I decided to still go quite fast and stick with a rather large brush so I can paint quickly, and I was fine with making a couple of smaller mistakes that I could fix later, but depending on your brush control you might want to slow down for this a little. The next color I used was Tenebrous Grey, which is a dark purplish grey that works great as a base color for stuff like dark leather. I used this to base coat the boots, the big holster on the left shoulder of the horses, the gloves and also the hoofs or claws of the mounts. Normally I would find different colors for these elements, but if you want to go fast, sometimes it's worth using the same color to cover different things. As long as they are not the main colors, it won't be very obvious on the final result, and you can still make them different by adding different highlights if you want. Then I painted all the short cropped manes of the horses with dark brown. And that took care of most of the base coats I needed to do with normal acrylic colors, so now I turned to base coating everything that was supposed to be metal later. I started by painting everything black, including the armor of the riders and of course all the other little metal bits as well, like the buckles on the leather harnesses, the swords, the guns and all the little decorative elements around the models I wanted to be metal. The reason for this is that 1, in my experience it's better to use metallic colors over black, and 2, I wanted to have 2 different metal surfaces. All the little metal bits I wanted to base coat fully with metallics, but the armor of the riders I wanted to have as a much darker metal, just like on the box art. The trick to do that quickly is to leave it black and only edge highlight them with metallic colors. Once everything was blacked in, I used gunmetal to base coat everything except the armor of the riders, taking extra care not to hit anything else with this since the metallic pigments are a pain to remove. Finally, I took some old gold and applied it only on some of the decorative elements like the eagle symbol on the chest of the mounts and the helmets of the riders, some skull symbols and eagles on the backpacks, the sword hilts and a couple of decorative trims on the weapon holsters.
Alright, with that I was done with all the base coats, and the whole process up until this point took me around 3 hours for the 5 models, so around a third of the time I wanted to spend overall, which is about right considering how much surface I had to paint on these guys.
Now the colors are on the models, but they look a little flat and not very defined for now, so let's do something about that by using a combination of shade and contrast paints. First of all, I diluted some Pterodon turquoise contrast paint with contrast medium, something like 50-50, and I applied this quite liberally over everything I had painted with the Oxford blue before. I did this for multiple reasons. First of all, I wanted to shade these elements a little to make them more defined and interesting. I also wanted to modify the color, since the original Oxford blue is not the most vibrant blue, but with the little green tint and the vibrancy the contrast gives, we will get a pretty similar color to the box art. At this point you might be wondering why I'm not simply using the contrast over the grey primer, and the reason for that is that it wouldn't be the right hue, and also it would give me the typical patchy contrast look on the models. It might be slower to paint a normal acrylic layer first and then apply a contrast paint over that, but it will look much better and smoother in the end, so for me at least it's worth it. And since I painted the pants with a different color, I also needed a different contrast paint to go over them. Stormfiend is perfect for this, and since it's much less vibrant than the Pterodon we used earlier, I simply used this undiluted out of the pot. For everything we painted with the Tenebrous Grey, like the boots and the weapon holsters, I simply used good old Agrex Earth Shade, slathering it quite liberally over everything. And I also used this to shade the mane of the horses as well. For the many leather elements, I used the obvious contrast choice of snakebite leather. Once again, I thinned it down to 50-50 with contrast medium, but looking back, I think I could have just used it undiluted out of the pot as well to get an even more defined look. This is probably the most dangerous part of this process, since once again we are painting quite close to the light skin of the horse, and it's very easy to mess it up quite badly with this yellowish contrast paint. It happened to me as well in a couple of places, and I needed to spend extra time later to clean it up. So once again, it might be worth going a little slower at this point to make sure you don't stain anything around the leather bits. I also use this to shade the gold elements as well, saving me another extra step of using something like Seraphim Sepia instead. All the bits that were fully coated in gunmetal got a nice thick layer of Nuln Oil, but I left the armor of the riders in the original black, not using any shading on them. Finally, I took some Garagak Sewer contrast paint and painted it all over the bases. Before priming, I used the Muddy Earth terrain paste on this, which gave it the texture, and during the zenithal it also got some grey overspray, so the contrast paint adds the necessary color and some little shading as well. That's all the shading done except one very important thing, the skin of the horses. Those are still quite flat and lacking in definition and contrast. Plus, I still needed to do the color transition from white to red that we can see on the box art. First, let's make the skin a little more interesting and defined. I thinned down some Seraphim Sepia wash with contrast medium. I started painting this from around the halfway point of the horse's body, dragging it down towards the feet. On the raised surfaces, I wanted this to only stain the skin a little, and wherever I felt it was too much, I even wiped it away with either the brush or my thumb. But I let it settle in the deeper areas more, like in between the muscles and the ribs. I tried to avoid too much pooling, since you can end up with some super dark bits in the recesses, so whenever I saw this happening, I soaked it up a little with an empty brush. The goal is to add a little bit of color variation and depth onto the skin in one simple step, but ideally we should avoid creating super dark shadows that would look out of place on an otherwise very bright surface. Okay, now let's do that red color transition on the legs. For this I took some Carroburg Crimson and used it undiluted. And I painted this starting from around halfway up the leg, dragging it down towards the feet again. I applied a single layer on all of the horses, then I did another layer, but this time only from the knee joints down. And finally I did a third layer, but only from the ankle joint and down. For both this and the Seraphim Sepia washing stage, it's very important to let the layer dry before touching that area again with the brush. Since we are painting multiple models anyway, you can simply paint one and do the same thing on a different model while the first one is drying. Rotating the models like this is quite efficient and can save you from your own impatience. In addition to the legs, I also painted this into the eagle and the serial number decoration on the hind leg and a little bit in between the ribs and around the visible veins on the skin as well. Once everything dries, you will probably end up with quite a few blemishes on the skin. Some separation lines between the red wash and the grey skin, some patches of shade where there shouldn't be any, and places where despite our best efforts the wash pooled a little too much. These can be fixed with a little cleaning up, depending on how much time you want to spend, or you can simply leave them since they won't be very visible from across the table anyway. I decided that I was making good progress, so I had around 20 minutes to spend on a little cleanup phase. I took the original grey cere and thinned it down to a consistency that is halfway between layering and glazing, and used this to clean up the skin a little. I outlined the tattoos and the veins and covered the most obvious blemishes. But it is very important to use quite diluted paint here and multiple layers, since any undiluted paint will stand out on the sprayed on layer, so it's possible to make things worse rather than better if you use too thick paint.
And with that, the models are base coated and shaded. Now we only need to apply the highlights to make them look even better. At this point I was 5 hours into the project, so I had another 5 hours left to do the highlights. And that is probably a good thing, since this is probably the most difficult and time-intensive part of the paint job, so we need extra time for it.
First of all, I used French blue to highlight all the blue colors, so the armor on the horses, the coats of the riders, but also the pants. I thought this would be quite fitting since the Death Korps guys were actually modeled after the French troops in the Great War. I simply edge highlighted everything, added a couple of scratches on the armor, and on the cloaks and pants I made some stylized highlights with scratches as well. These look a bit rough up close, but from an arm's length away they add a lot of definition and they can be done in moments. For the second highlight I switched to pale blue and did the same, but this time I tried to be a little thinner with my lines and I only painted this on some of the edges and not all of them. I concentrated mostly on the edges facing up and the ones I felt would be hit by the light the most. For the masks, I turned to the original base coat color for my first highlight since now it was brighter thanks to the shade we applied on the surface. Basically I covered everything facing up, leaving a little of the shaded darker color in the shadows, and since I used the same color on the arm wraps, I simply edge highlighted those with this color as well. To push the highlights a little further, I switched to ice yellow and used it to add even smaller highlights and finer edge highlights. For everything I had painted with Tenebrous Grey originally, so the claws of the mounts, the boots, the gloves and the holsters, I simply mixed in some white into the grey and used that as my first highlight. I used mostly edge highlights here where I could and a couple of stylized scratches on the larger surfaces. Then for the second highlight I added even more white into this mix and used this to add some finer edge highlights on the most prominent edges and corners. For the leather bits I used saddle brown to edge highlight everything, and where there was space I also added some scratches coming in diagonally from the sides of the straps. For the second leather highlight I switched to cork and I used this lighter color to add some thinner edge highlights and some more scratches in the most visible areas. Now we are coming to the metals. For all the steel elements I used the original metal gunmetal from AK Interactive to highlight everything. I used edge highlights where I could, but the smaller bits I painted back almost fully, only leaving a little shaded area where possible. I also used this to edge highlight all of the black armor, making it look like it is actually really dark metal. I added a couple of scratches here and there as well to sell the metal effect a bit more, but the large surfaces like the shoulder pauldrons I will cover with some transfers anyway, so no need to do too much. For the second highlight I used silver from Vallejo, simply because this was the brightest metal color I could find. Feel free to simply use the brightest silver paint you have handy. I used this only on the most prominent edges to add a little extra shine to the metal. On all the gold bits I used the original color, old gold, to edge highlight everything and bring back their shine. I didn't use the second highlight on the gold since these elements are so small and I was running out of time and a little bit of patience as well.
But now we are in the home stretch. Mostly everything on the models is highlighted. I only needed to take care of some smaller but still quite important elements before calling them done.
First of all, I highlighted the base by first dry brushing mud brown over the raised bits of the terrain paste. Then I followed this up with a lighter dry brushing of green brown. I made sure to apply less pressure over the second one and cover less surface so the previous color remains visible. And now for those red eyes on the horses and the riders. To begin with, I made sure that the whole surface is covered with black. Then I base coated everything with Mephiston red, leaving a black line between the red and the metallic rim around the lens. Switching to Wild Rider red, I painted a relatively thick line around the bottom curve of the eye lenses. And finally, with Troll Slayer orange, I painted an even thinner line at the very bottom of the same curve, leaving plenty of the previous color visible. Now I just had to add a couple of transfers on the shoulder pauldrons. I went with a winged skull on the right pauldrons and a red skull on a white field over the left ones. It's probably not canonically correct, but it looks good, so who cares. Now I just had to paint the base rims black and add a couple of dry grass tufts on the bases to make them look a little less barren, and I was finished. So after around 10 hours total for the 5 models, the end result looks like this. They might not look perfect if you look at them too close, but from the other end of the table they look pretty close to the box art to impress your opponent, and they won't cost you your sanity to paint. But what do you guys think? Do these look good enough for the time invested, or do you prefer to put more or maybe less work in yours? Let me know in the comments.
I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. But before I sign off, I wanted to remind you that the PDF painting guide for this project and many more besides is available on my Patreon. My Patreon members are the ones that make this channel possible, so they deserve a huge thank you as always, especially the ones in the captain level. Thanks again for watching and see you guys in the next one.